Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us today. My name is Tokozani Liwewe. I am a former Biosecurity Game Changers Fellow, and it is my pleasure to moderate today's seminar. Our discussion today focuses on building next generation biosecurity leadership, bridging science, policy, and global governance for pandemic preparedness. Developing the next generation of leaders is absolutely critical if we want the world to be better prepared to anticipate, prevent, and respond to future biological threats. Today's seminar reflects on the work of the Biosecurity Game Changers program and the new Biological Threat Reduction Fellowship run by the Pandemic Center at Brown University, as well as other efforts to advance next-gen leadership in biological threat reduction. We will also explore why strengthening next-gen leadership capacity, particularly in the Global South, is so essential for global biosecurity. So to our audience, please feel free to engage and ask questions in the Q&A section on your screen. So we are so fortunate to have a distinguished panel with us today who bring expertise from policy, science, global governance, and practical biological threat reduction implementation. So allow me to briefly introduce our panelists. So we have Dr. Elizabeth Cameron, also known as Beth. She's a professor of the practice and senior advisor to the Pandemic Center at the Brown University School of Public Health. She also previously served as a senior advisor for global health security at the U.S. Agency for International Development and is a practitioner, senior fellow of the Miller Center at the University of Virginia. Beth is a global leader in health security and biodefense. She has served over 2 decades within and outside of government to facilitate change. She spent 2 tours on the White House National Security Council staff, twice helping establish and lead the Directorate on Global Health Security and Biodefense. In this role, she built and led a robust team focused every day on leaning forward to prevent, detect, and rapidly respond to biological crises. Beth has held senior posts at the Departments of State and Defense, where she created and oversaw biological and chemical security efforts. Outside of government, she led and was an architect of NTI-BIO, a program of the Nuclear Threat Initiative aimed at countering biological catastrophes, and she served at the American Cancer Society. She got her start in government as a AAAS fellow at the State Department and in the office of Senator Edward M. Kennedy. Beth holds a PhD in biology from the Human Genetics and Molecular Biology program at the Johns Hopkins University and a BA in biology from the University of Virginia. She is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Also important to highlight that Beth and Wilmot, who unfortunately was unable to join us today due to other conflicting commitments, designed and are the leads of the Biosecurity Game Changers program, which we will discuss today, and the Biological Threat Reduction course and fellowship that will be starting very soon. Our next panelist is Zibusiso Masuku, also known as Z, who serves as a Senior Biosafety and Biosecurity Technical Officer at Africa CDC. He leads the implementation of the Continental Health Agency's Biosafety and Biosecurity Initiative, a program developed to strengthen the biosafety and biosecurity capabilities of African Union member states. He is a global health security professional specializing in the implementation of regional policies and is a proponent of sustainable best practices in high and maximum containment facilities. He has over 18 years of experience in the health security space with a keen interest in the enterprising application of context-tailored mitigation measures for the sustainable operation of biocontainment facilities in resource-constrained environments. He has served in various expert roles, including current co-chair of the Biosecurity and Biosurveillance Technical Working Group of the SIMBA initiative, led the establishment of the Regional Center of Excellence for Biosafety and Biosecurity for Southern Africa as a member of the WHO Technical Advisory Group on Biosafety, and currently is an expert consultant and qualified expert of the United Nations Secretary General's mechanisms for the investigation of alleged use of chemical, biological, or toxic weapons. So last but not least, we have Sandra Martini, who is a biosafety and biosecurity expert and laboratory scientist in shaping global health security at the intersection of policy, implementation, and emerging technologies. She serves as an African regional subject matter expert for biosafety and biosecurity with the Africa CDC and is a 2024-2025 Biosecurity Game Changers Fellow, where she was placed with the BWC Implementation Support Unit. She is also a 2023 Youth for Biosecurity Fellow and current SPA Fellow, where her research focuses on strengthening AI biogovernance. She has led and advised national and regional efforts to strengthen biorisk management systems and health security capacities, including Uganda's pilot and domestication of the WHO Global Guidance Framework for the Responsible Use of Life Sciences. Her work bridges policy and implementation, supporting governments and partners, including national ministries, WHO, WOA, amongst others, to operationalize biosecurity, biosafety, and dual-use research governance frameworks. She is the executive director and co-founder of Neo Bioscience, a global health security think tank delivering policy advisory, workforce development, technical assistance, and pandemic preparedness solutions, with work spanning Africa and global partnerships. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have a wonderful panel with us today. And thank you for joining us, to all our panelists. And let us begin our discussion. So before we dive into specific programs and experiences, it might be useful to frame what we mean by next generation biosecurity leadership. So I'll start with you, Beth. When we talk about next generation biosecurity leadership, what does that actually mean in practice, in your perspective? And why is this type of leadership particularly important at this moment?
Thanks so much, Toko, and thanks for leading this effort and just for putting this seminar together, across, which is hosted and run by our Game Changers fellows and former fellows. This is my favorite topic, and the reason it is my favorite topic is because there are so many challenges right now that affect us in the realm of biological risks. Everything from increasing risks of naturally occurring disease threats. We know the next pandemic is not a matter of if, but when, to the rising likelihood of an accidental or deliberate biological release as we see emerging technologies advancing both to help us solve the disease threats of the future, but also those emerging technologies pose additional risks, especially as we see the accelerated capabilities of artificial intelligence when paired with biodesign tools. And so the reason, so first to answer your first question, Thoko, I think next generation biosecurity leadership is not just about what you hear in a classroom. I think that stands to reason, particularly for Game Changers fellows, and we'll talk more about that program in a minute. It's really about getting operational experience in managing biological risks as early as possible. And that includes technical training for many experts who are focused on biosafety and biosecurity. And we'll hear from Zibosiso soon about the work he's doing at Africa CDC in that regard. But it's also about learning about emerging risks from the people who are most likely to understand them. So emerging technologies I was just speaking about, they're advancing quickly. They're being developed in many countries, including my own, largely outside of the government, and largely by people who are themselves rising leaders. So one of the best ways to understand risk is for the people who are actually developing those tools and technologies to be part of the solution set, both from a technical perspective and informing policymakers. And so one of the things I'm most passionate about with Game Changers and with all of my work is helping rising leaders who may have technical training in certain areas get the operational and policy-making and decision-making training that they need in order to be effective leaders, and also so that they can influence leaders in their own governments and regions. Maybe I'll just stop there, Toko, but just to say, I think but to me, biosecurity leadership is about actually actioning new policies and new technical innovations. And that really starts at the rising leader stage. There shouldn't be this gap between being a rising leader and being a decision maker. We need you now more than ever in the world that we live in, this increasingly chaotic world, to be actually involved in the decision-making process.
Great. Thank you for that, Beth. I loved what you said. It's not about what you hear in a classroom, it's about operational experiences. That's really powerful. Z, any thoughts and reflections on next gen biosecurity leadership in general?
Good day, Togo. Good day, colleagues. Hi, Beth, and Sandra and colleagues. Apologies for dialing in late, but yeah, it's great that the show is on the road. This is why Monday is my favorite day of the weekend on Friday. But yeah, so for me, I think an apt way of looking at next generation leaders in our space, really. There's a particular saying that I ascribe to of late, which says the beginning of true wisdom is knowing that when you plant a tree, you will not live to sit under its shade. And I imagine our next generation leaders being providing that shade. Ours is to create structures and a platform for them to grow and provide us that shade from these emerging biological threats as well as those that are released intentionally and also unintentionally. And I'll speak a bit more when I get an opportunity to talk about what Africa CDC is doing in this space. But I really echo what Beth has spoken to. Really, we want to have leaders who have operational experience, who are able to adapt with situations on the ground and really respond to these threats that we seem to be facing on an ongoing basis. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Z. So, building on that, particularly from the perspective of Africa CDC, like you said, and regional biosecurity capacity building, what initiatives is the Africa CDC currently championing to advance next-gen biosecurity leadership in Africa?
Thank you, Tor. If I may, I think I'll just to give a bit of context and background. So, the Africa CDC is a continental autonomous health agency of the African Union. It was established to support public health initiatives of member states and strengthen their capabilities for their public health institutions to detect, prevent, control, and respond quickly and effectively to disease threats. So I lead the implementation of the Africa CDC's Biosafety and Biosecurity initiative. This was launched in 2019 with a broad mandate really to strengthen health security capabilities of African Union member states. So last year, we commissioned a review or an evaluation of the program, and the results were quite positive, indicating that the initiative had put in place the regional structures and frameworks that were required to develop local capacities. So we've since validated our 2026 to 2030 strategy, which is a future-backed strategic approach to drive programmatic action through the implementation of seven thematic pillars. One of these pillars really speaks to growing of the implementation of what we call our regional training and certification program for biosafety and biosecurity professionals. So this is where a space where I see game changers and fellows who've gone through this process actually contributing within the Biosafety and Biosecurity Initiative program as a whole. So this program, the training and certification program, really was launched in 2022. And in essence, what it is a homegrown Africa-led sustainable program that seeks to certify our professionals within the health security space. Currently, we have four specializations in the program, which are biorisk management, waste management, biocontainment engineering, and biosafety cabinet certification. And these really largely spoke to the priorities of our African Union member states. In this year, we're actually working aligned to something that Beth mentioned, to emerging technologies. We are developing two new areas of specialization, one on cyber biosecurity and artificial intelligence, as well as one on lab equipment maintenance and calibration. And really, why I'm bringing this program as a sort of like a lending space or one that is best suited for our game changers really is that what it seeks to do is to recognize individuals with proficiencies in the space. What it also does is to give a proficiency progression. So an individual coming into the space, so a young leader or an individual coming into the laboratory space has a clear understanding of the journey that they need to go through in building a skill set in any of the areas of specialization that I've just mentioned. And really, really at the moment, the bulk of the work that we are doing really is aligning many of the different initiatives that are happening on the continent, because this program does not seek to replace what is already on the African continent, because a lot of efforts that have been happening, it seeks to just align and have like a knowledge base baseline that is developed on the continent, and then advance such that we have developed a critical mass of cadre that can help us address and respond to disease threats, however they may occur. In the future, as we expand the program or as it gains traction, I see that we will have a vast array of young individuals who come through the program and who have the desirable skill sets, which are sort of grounded in context specificity. So both by developing skills, your traditional skill sets, but also an understanding of how they are applied within their different contexts. And I mean, as I alluded to earlier on, and in terms of using the imagery of shading from a tree, I imagine that over some few years, when we look back, we'll be able to see the fruits of this program, particularly those that have gone through the program formally from the first level up to expert level. Maybe I will pause there for your reflection. Yeah.
No, thank you, Z. I love what you said that these programs are grounded in context specificity, which is very
Yeah.
essential within our contexts. So, where do you see opportunities to expand these programs to better serve African countries? And Beth or Sandra, feel free to add on to this as well.
Thank you, Togo, for that. So for us, so as I mentioned, so Africa CDC really it has put in place the structures. Ours is to provide technical support and coordination and really the oversight of the program. Our intention is not to train individuals per se, but is to put in place the structures to enable that. And this particular program, the training and certification program that I've spoken to, is delivered in what are called regional centers of excellence. Currently, we have 3 centers of excellence. The first one was in Johannesburg, South Africa, which I actually was proud to lead since inception till a little while ago. And the second one was in Eastern Africa in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and the next one, West Africa in Institut Pasteur de Dakar in Senegal. Now, the purpose of the decentralization is for the centers to own the program regionally, for the centers to disseminate the information and actually grow the program. So that regional centric understanding and collective growth within the space allows our leaders, young leaders as well as experienced leaders, to really ensure that the developments and the skill sets, proficiencies that we are putting in place really are embedded into our national systems. One of the elements that we are speaking about in recent times is really encouraging our African Union member states not to look at biosafety and biosecurity as a standalone pillar, but a contributory factor within our preparedness and response. A number of our member states are putting in applications within the Pandemic Fund, and to try and ensure that this doesn't stand alone. And really, this is key to ensuring the sustainability within our member states. One of the biggest problems is that most of the gains that have been founded to date have largely depended on external donors, and we really are looking to shift the focus that our leaders do understand the value of the work that we're doing, and that they actually fund it from the national purse. So really, I think sort of to sum it up, really is to, I think, be it Brown or other partners beyond Game Changers, but within the same space, the idea is to work through the centers of excellence and really grow the program. Ours is to really provide the technical support and the and the leverage, I think, within the continental body, as it were. Yeah, I don't know, Beth, I think this is really aligned to some of the elements that we've talked about, and I'd like to hear your thoughts as well. Over.
So Z, first, just to congratulate you and Africa CDC for growing this program. I mean, it's really been incredible to watch a continental-wide biosafety and biosecurity program start as a seed and now be blooming into this tree. I like your analogy very, very much, which from which now rising leaders can dock into this work. And the one thing that I do want to say, just maybe from personal experience, is that you're quite right. A lot of the work in biosafety and biosecurity, and really in global health generally, has been a lot of that work has been relied upon for external donors, and some of that has been very helpful. I've been part of that work. I've been proud of to be part of that work. You've certainly been part of that work with the global partnership too, Z. But there needs to be a sustainable mechanism for this work to be rooted in the continent and to be able to become not a separate pillar, but part and parcel to emerging infectious disease preparedness, pandemic preparedness and response. And for quite a long time in my career, biosafety and biosecurity has been sometimes viewed as a separate sort of policy related pillar or something associated only with people who work in a high containment lab like the one that you helped work in lead, Z. And unfortunately, we know that biosafety and biosecurity are much broader than that. They goes all the way to synthetic biology. We'll hear from Sandra and her experience soon, from collecting a pathogen, getting a case in a hospital, all the way through inventory management and destruction. And it includes the risks that something could be misused accidentally or deliberately. And so the program that you're building is really the foundation for institutionalizing this work. And making biosafety and biosecurity more of a technical discipline in addition to a policy one. And those things, in my view, just need to come closer and closer together so that when we think about outbreak preparedness and response, we're thinking about biosafety and biosecurity automatically and not as something that comes later or after the new technology is created or after the lab is built. So just congratulations is what I would say most of all. I think that you're just, it's wonderful to see you in this role and to see this work growing the way that it has.
Thank you, Z. Thank you, Beth, for those insights. And indeed, it's always inspiring to hear the amazing work that's happening at the Africa CDC. So, Beth, I'd like us to look particularly at the design and the vision of the Biosecurity Game Changers Fellowship and the Biological Threat Reduction Fellowship as practical examples of building next-gen leadership. So, when you designed the Biosecurity Game Changers Fellowship and the most recent Biological Threat Reduction Fellowship, what gap in global biosecurity leadership were you trying to address? And how do these programs differ from other next-gen leadership initiatives? And just before you answer, just reminder to the audience that please, you can ask questions on the Q&A chat, and we will come to them at the end of the discussion. So over to you, Beth. You're on mute, Beth.
I muted myself instead of unmuting myself. Apologies. So I'm glad you asked this question, and we've already gotten to some of the elements. Z's mentioned them, you've mentioned them. So the game change, and I want to start first by saying that this program started as an experiment, as a hypothesis. And it was a hypothesis that was driven by experiences that were coming from people like Z, who many of us have worked with and partnered with, other people across the continent at Africa CDC, like Yanu Kabedi, who's done so much work on laboratory management and biosafety and biosecurity. But also really it came from the partners, and I'm going to mention some of the partners in a minute. We went out and we asked the question, what is the gap? Why aren't there more opportunities for rising leaders in this field? And more importantly, at the policy level, why is it that biosafety and biosecurity is recognized as such an important area, but it is chronically underfunded, underprioritized, and not in the top leaders level discussions about pandemics? And what that led us to was a recognition that rising leaders are not always well prepared to think about worst case scenarios. They're trained to think about what's going to happen with the pathogen that they're working in or what's going to happen with the last disease that emerged, not what could happen in the future and how do we prevent that from happening or how do we mitigate the response, how do we mitigate a worst case scenario. Professionalization, career paths for biological professionals remain siloed. There were people training to be medical doctors, people training in biotechnology, people training in biosafety and biosecurity, but there wasn't really an integrated approach for talking about these issues. Many multilateral and other operational organizations were working in their very specific areas, prioritizing research and development for pandemic preparedness, prioritizing medical countermeasures distribution or lab capacity or biosafety. But we weren't seeing those organizations all prioritizing biosafety and biosecurity as a critical element of their work. And that was from speaking with many of them. And then you hit this, Thoko. Practical, operational, experiential learning is often missing and really hard to get for rising leaders who are in their field, and frequently hard to get without leaving a secure job position to do it. So when we designed the Game Changers program, and we've brought that into the next phase of that effort, which is the Strengthening Biological Threat Reduction Program in Africa that we're just now building, we went out to 5 partners, and the partners were CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, IBIS, the International Biosecurity and Biosafety Initiative for Science, the Biological Weapons Implementation Support Unit. We talked to Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and we talked to the Pandemic Action Network, which is now known as the Resilience Action Network, or RANI or RANA on the African continent. And of course, we talked to our partners at Africa CDC as an institutional partner. And we spoke with the Science for Africa Foundation, which has a deep commitment to training the next generation of biological scientific leaders on the continent. And what we came up with was a program that places emerging leaders half-time in one of those organizations in order to get that operational experience and to begin to design their own program, but also contribute to the mission of the organization. And we started working with leaders like you, Toko, and Sandra, who we'll hear from soon. And we were able to, and really fortunate to select 8 amazing rising leaders, many of whom are situated on the African continent, who were able to continue to contribute to their current day jobs while also developing projects of their own. And what that led to was the beginning of a network. And that network we would like to see expand. And now we want to see you, and you already are, by leading this effort here today, the seminar series, by leading a journal club, by leading your own work. And programs coming out of the fellowship. The goal is really for you to take that experience and translate it into policies and programs that improve biological threat reduction on the continent. And so the next phase of this work, the Strengthening Biological Threat Reduction Program, which is supportive of the Game Changers effort, is to have a course that will run this year and next year for about 30 rising leaders, which will dive deeply into different areas of biological threat and allow for discussion and allow for policy discussion as well as technical discussion. And then 6 of those leaders that are part of that course, they haven't yet been selected. We're in the middle of sorting through so many great applications. Those leaders will then go on to be placed in an organization. And this time, Africa CDC is able to support a placement thanks to Z. And the goal here is to actually think about a policy on the African continent and be able to contribute to actually institutionalizing that policy over time. So it's ambitious. We are also partnering with Science for Africa Foundation to find a way to sustain this program on the African continent over a longer period of time as an African-led African initiative. That's something we're very passionate about at the Pandemic Center. We are a coordinator, we provide platforms, but the leadership for this effort really does need to continue to be driven from the continent itself. And that's why we're so glad to have partners like Z who are helping us make sure that happens.
Great, thank you, Beth. As a former Game Changers fellow, it was really an amazing experience being mentored by Beth and all the other global leaders in the space. One of the things that was very exciting was the Munich Security Conference, and I wanted to ask you a bit about this experience. The program brought emerging leaders from the Global South, this is the fellows, to the Munich Security Conference. Why is that inclusion important for strengthening global biosecurity? So bringing next-gen leaders into such spaces.
Yeah, well, I should also say that this was an idea that came also from our partnership with all of you, Thoko, as we were discussing its experiences and missing pieces in the global architecture where rising leaders were not yet included and where your voices really could make a huge impact. Working with the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, CEPI, and the Nuclear Threat Initiative and foreign policy, and most importantly, with rising leaders like yourself, and you could easily brief this as well as me, Thoko, but thanks for asking the question. You brought together senior leaders who were coming to the Munich Security Conference to talk about the intersection of national and international security and biological threats, including how can we be better prepared for the next pandemic, including how does artificial intelligence intersect with biological design tools to potentially make it easier to create a biological weapon? And also importantly, why do we also need that intersection to happen to make better vaccines, tests, treatments, and PPE? And how do we grapple with this really important technical and policy question? So you convened leaders from all over the world, but importantly, rising leaders from other programs as well. So many Youth for Biosecurity fellows also participated, and we had representation from most continents, I think. I have to go back and look. And coming out of that event, there was really a recognition, not only from yourselves, but from those that attended, that this voice is really missing. You energized people. You led a discussion about what you're worried about and what you'd like to see policymakers focus on. And that led to a declaration, and we'll post it in the chat, that was put together by rising leaders from the Global South, that both says, hey, we need to be at events like this so that we're keeping, first of all, we know what the risks and threats are. And second of all, we're not going to be able to govern. We are the future governors. We're not going to be able to do that effectively if we're not part of the conversation now and we're not starting to understand what some of the issues here are. So the rising leaders declaration talks specifically about your goal and our goal, and I share this goal of taking pandemic threats off the table in support of the 100 days mission, which is a goal of within no more than 100 days being able to develop and surge medical countermeasures, so vaccines, tests, treatments, personal protective equipment for a major biological emergency. And so there's pillars pointed out there, and you can sign on if you haven't already. For those in the audience, I've signed on. I think most of us have signed on. And the goal there is really to create even a broader network of rising leaders in support of a very specific and important goal.
Thanks, Beth. I'd like to allow Z and Sandra to maybe jump on this as well. Just why is this inclusion of emerging leaders, specifically from the Global South, essential for these conversations about biosecurity globally? Z, Sandra.
Thank you, Tor and Beth. I mean, for me, I reflect to my own journey. I think the understanding of the global health security architecture really, I think the enlightenment happened in being in those platforms. Although we're not trying to clone ourselves, but I think there is value in what you spoke about before, the experiential learning. I think exposure to these platforms, understanding the systems, the way decisions are made, really informs a better understanding and development of a well-rounded global leader. I think it also helps in understanding how we can influence change, because I think that is sort of one of the biggest things that I think the next generation really wants to do. It may seem that policy really takes long to move ahead because of bureaucracy or certain elements related to that. But I think really the exposure to those spaces and getting a close familiarity with the processes therein, I really think is a strong strong attribute in determining in developing our next generation leaders. Yeah, over.
Uh,
Yes, Sandra.
Toko, I will go. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Toko. It's such a pleasure for me to be here today and speak about the Game Changers Fellowship and similar initiatives that I'm very, very passionate about. So to talk about the question that you asked about inclusion of the next gen leaders from the global south in these spaces, really, I would say that this inclusion is not really just about representation, but it's about the relevancy and the effectiveness of whatever policies that are enacted or those discussions that happen. Because if I can draw back to what Beth said, as the next gen leaders, we know the risks. We are the future governors. So not including next gen leaders in these spaces means the global biosecurity space is really detached from the reality, because as the next gen leaders, as the rising leaders, we are the ones who know the many biological risks, such as the emerging, and many of these are first detected in the global south. So many of the rising leaders are working in spaces where they are at the forefront of detection of these risks and the emerging risks. The implementation happens within the national systems in these regions where very many young people are involved. So removing them from the tables where decisions are being made that are going to influence the work that they are doing is really working without the reality of what is on ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. And I'll move on to you as an alumni of the fellowship program. You have firsthand experience with these initiatives. So, as a former Biosecurity Game Changers fellow, and of course, an alumni of a few other fellowships, particularly for this fellowship, what was the most valuable takeaway from the program for you personally?
Thanks, Toko. That's a great question. So one of the most valuable takeaways from the Biosecurity Game Changers Fellowship for me was a shift from how I understood where influence in biosecurity actually happens. So before this fellowship, for the people that know me, the people that I've worked with, my work was already grounded in biosafety and biosecurity implementation. Particularly, I was doing work in risk management, national level and regional engagements. For example, I had been involved in piloting the WHO Global Guidance Framework for the Responsible Use of Life Sciences here in Uganda. But with the fellowship and with the placement that I had with the BWCISU, it helped me to expand my lens beyond implementation into now the global policy and governance systems. While I worked with the BWCISU, I really gained direct exposure to how international biosecurity norms are shaped and advanced. And more importantly, I saw where the gaps are, particularly the disconnect between the global commitments that are made in the rooms that we just talked about and the national level implementation. So that experience for me was very fundamentally shifting in how I approach my work. So because of that, I now moved from thinking about how do we implement a particular framework to now thinking about how do we actually align global governance, national systems, and institutional practices so that we have implementation that actually happens and it's sustained. So we do not have policies that are not followed by implementation, or you have a disconnect between the implementation and the policies. And so for me, that shift from implementation alone to policy-informed system thinking has been one of the most defining outcomes of the fellowship. Thank you, Togo.
Thank you, Sandra. And I love that we are removing that disconnect through between implementation and policy. I really love that. And my personal experience was that as well. It's also not just about science, it's about policy. So we're bridging those gaps that exist. So thank you for those insights. So could you share a little bit more about your specific project with the BWC and how that has also influenced some of your work I know one thing that you did within your organization was also start up a fellowship as well. So would love to hear a little bit more about how your experience in the fellowship has influenced some of the projects that you are up to.
Right. So a concrete way in this has shaped my work is how I've, expanded into the policy-focused and forward-looking areas, particularly around emerging technologies. If you can remember, during the time of the fellowship, I had initiated a project along the lines of AI governance, initially by recognition of just the technological advances that were outpacing existing policy frameworks. And this was partly informed by my previous work in the space of synthetic biology and just keeping track of what is happening and how, policies are being shaped or the discussions that are happening. And I wasn't seeing so much of that, especially happening on the African continent. And so I got very interested in how, as a young uprising leader in the space, can actually contribute to that. So I started out this as an exploratory effort, which has since evolved into a core area of my work. Because as you introduced me earlier, I'm currently with the SPA Fellowship and other ongoing engagements, where I've gone deeper into the space of looking at how African countries can better anticipate and govern risks at the intersection of artificial intelligence and biotech. And this has directly influenced how I contribute to policy processes. I got the opportunity to contribute to the development of the new Africa CDC Biosafety and Biosecurity Initiative strategy for the next 5 years. And particularly here, I supported the area on integrating emerging technologies into biosecurity planning and governance, which wasn't the case before, I got into this space and got into the mentorship that the fellowship came with. So the fellowship didn't just expose me to policy, it really catalyzed how a shift in the type of policy work that I engage in, moving towards more anticipatory and future-oriented governance. But that will not go without me talking about, some of the leadership and the systems building that I've done because of this fellowship. Because of the Biosecurity Game Changers Fellowship, I got I got to start a fellowship and my organization, No Bioscience, which is the African Women Leadership Initiative, aimed at building leadership capacity of African young women in biosecurity and global health security. And yeah, this was inspired by the Game Changers Fellowship. So through this initiative, we are focusing on, again, looking at the next generation women leaders in biosecurity, equipping them not just with technical knowledge, but with the ability to actually navigate policy, leadership, and implementation, aimed at, again, removing that, bridging the two, where we have science and policy are bridged. So because of that, for me, this fellowship really made it very, very clear. We do not just need more experts, but we need leaders who can operate across systems and drive change within them, right? So if I have to summarize the impact of the Biosecurity Game Changers Fellowship, it has really expanded my work from implementing biosecurity programs to shaping how those systems are designed, governed, and led, and both now and in the context of emerging technologies. So, and the changing emerging risks. So you will be seeing me a little more in this space of emerging risks and how all this is governed. Thank you so much, Toko, and back
Wow,
to you.
that is so powerful, Sandra, and the work that you're doing is truly inspiring. So Sandra is a great example of the impact of the Game Changers Fellowship and initiatives like this to build next-gen biosecurity leadership. So I'd like to pose this question to the panelists as well around, particularly Beth and Zibusiso. So for institutions interested in developing similar programs, what are the foundational elements that are most important to make these initiatives impactful? What advice would you give? Because we've got a diverse audience, people who want to be the next gen leaders, but there are others who are saying, okay, I want to start up something like this within my institution, within my context. So just what advice would you give them? So I'll start with Beth and then Z.
I'll be brief because I think a lot of what I've learned about this I've learned from Z and also honestly from the Game Changers fellows themselves who were part of our initial catalytic experiment. I mean, you just heard Sandra explain better than I ever could, what the goals are here for the next generation to be able to cut across silos and translate their experience for a broader audience. I would say one thing is be clear about what experience your fellows will have. Make sure that they have one very targeted project so that they can start with that and then grow from it. It's helpful for there to be something very well thought out. We had fellows that came into their placements with more or less well-defined projects, depending on the personality of the fellow. I find that it's incredibly helpful to have a well-designed specific project to start with so that the fellow can begin to root themselves in the core principles of what you're trying to achieve and also the institution and then grow. And then second, equally, if not more important, is that the fellows will have ideas themselves and you need to make space for the fellow to develop their own ideas, programs, and efforts. The idea for a seminar series, the idea for the podcast that another one of our fellows, Dina Nasiki, runs, the idea for the Rising Leaders a statement that is in the chat, the idea for the journal club, those were all ideas that we didn't envision at all. They came from fellows, they came from people who were involved in the program, and none of those things would have happened if there wasn't space and options. So view yourselves as fellowship designers as a platform that can be used by really brilliant young next generation leaders and allow them to design some elements of their work themselves. You'll be, I think, amazed at what comes out. I know I was.
Thank you, Beth. I think in the interest of time, let us address a few questions in the chat. Z, we'll get back to you. So there are a few questions directed towards you, Z. So one question says, this is a really insightful talk. My question goes to Z. How far has Africa CDC gone with the push for African governments to fund these programs internally? And what has been the stumbling block, if any, in these efforts? So over to you, Z.
Thank you, Togo, and colleagues. I think to start off, I'll highlight one of the sort of milestones that Africa City has done. Our Director General last year, around this time, actually in April 2025, launched what we call the Green Book, which is Rethinking Africa's Health Financing in a New Era. And this is like a strategic document that was launched by the Africa CDC at the African Union with a specific goal of addressing health financing in our member states, looking at the low domestic resourcing, and just looking at all other commitments that African Union member states have done in the past. It looks at shaping and adapting our evolving economic landscapes. And really, so why I'm highlighting this is that at a very high level, we have continental frameworks, and we have our senior leadership speaking to heads of states and senior government officials. Then coming down to the program as well, what we have done as Africa CDC in putting together the Biosafety and Biosecurity Initiative, we've given a platform where we can have our efforts aligned with regional and international partners. One example is the development of the collaboration that we have with the global partnership. Beth mentioned this a bit earlier, where we have launched the Signature Initiative to mitigate biological threats in Africa. This is a key platform where African countries, African institutions working with global partnership countries come together to formulate risk mitigation measures that can be implemented. Those GP countries can provide catalytic financial support or technical support, really, in having a collective threat mitigation process. Our program is funded through Global Affairs Canada through that Signature Initiative. We also have another flagship program called the Health Security Partnership in Africa, which speaks to sort of defining the health and security interface, because oftentimes when we speak about health security, we are speaking about more from a public health context, but it is important to also look at it from a lens of deliberate biological threats, as well as is coming to the fore now with the emerging technologies. It's also afforded us the opportunity as well to establish partnerships. Beth spoke about CEPI. We've worked with partners in the region, the African Society for Laboratory Medicine, the Global Health Security Fund in Geneva. And really, this has helped us align the way that funding is directed in catalyzing some activities on the continent, and really trying to embed when it comes to sustainability within our member states. We will continue, and this is part of our new strategy, raising the bar, advocacy, and awareness to our member states and supporting them really in trying to finance some of the initiatives that they are implementing in country. Yeah, I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thanks, Z. Yes, Beth?
And Togo, I'll just hit two questions. I want to make sure Sandra gets our last word and that you do too. But one question in the chat that I said I would answer live is just this question about what countries can do and prioritize. Z hit some of those, mentioned some of those things, but he also mentioned earlier that a good example, there's a lot of funding for high containment labs. Often laboratories are built, and the biosafety and biosecurity pieces of that work are not adequately funded. In addition, it's not a requirement in research and development grants that are in infectious disease related areas to include biosafety and biosecurity resources. We think that should change. There's something called the International Biofunders Compact that CEPI, NTI, and others have pioneered. We are very supportive of that here at the Pandemic Center. Very supportive of the Pandemic Fund, as Z mentioned, funding in the biosafety and biosecurity area as a piece of their laboratory and early warning disease surveillance strengthening efforts. So those are two areas. And then someone asked about the fellowship. It is closed. We just finished applications for this round, but watch this space. We'll be opening it up again next year. And if there are more opportunities, you'll see them posted on our site. Over to you, Sandra. Or actually, back to you, Toko. Sorry. I'm throwing it around.
Thanks, Beth. No, anything, Sandra?
No, I would just give my last remarks, really saying the next generation biosecurity leadership is not about building expertise, really. It's about building the systems and the leaders who can carry this work forward. Because ultimately, our impact will not be measured by what we know, but what we enable others and our institutions to sustain. And that cannot be possible without building the capacity of the rising leaders. So let's continue with the efforts. And I saw a question in the chat about what other institutions or different partners can actually do to develop similar programs, which has been talked about. I'm really happy to know that there are people who are thinking of even doing more of this. Thank you.
No, thank you, Sandra. So as we conclude today's seminar, I would like to thank our panelists for such a thoughtful and engaging discussions. It's been amazing. Thank you so much for joining us, Z, Beth, Sandra. So today's conversation, I hope, has highlighted the importance of investing in next generation leadership and ensuring that the voices of next-gen leaders from the Global South are actively shaping global biosecurity governance. I would also like to thank the team at the Pandemic Center for the coordination and every one of you for joining us today. Please note that a recording of this webinar will be available on YouTube in about a week's time. So thank you all for participating. It's been wonderful, and goodbye and have a wonderful rest of the day.